Summer of 1942 found American soldiers in Milne Bay, Papua New Guinea, facing a crisis that nobody saw coming. Men were dying at rates 7 times higher than normal combat casualties, but not from enemy fire. The killer came from within their own mess kits. Here stood the mightiest military machine the world had ever seen, capable of unleashing bombs across vast oceans, storming hostile shores with coordinated precision, orchestrating massive operations involving hundreds of thousands of troops. Yet this unstoppable force couldn't solve what farmers had mastered generations ago: keeping food from rotting under relentless tropical heat. Across the Pacific, field hospital doctors watched in helpless frustration as vital medicines arrived completely useless, destroyed by the brutal sun. Blood plasma, the crucial difference between soldiers surviving shock or bleeding out alone in a foxhole, spoiled during transport before it ever reached the fighting men who needed it most. When the 374th Troop Carrier Group sat down for Thanksgiving dinner featuring canned turkey, the entire unit ended up hospitalized with dysentery. While Pentagon officials debated ammunition tonnage and strategy priorities, something remarkable was already unfolding 8,000 miles away in Minneapolis. A self-taught mechanic who'd learned engineering by devouring technical books after sweeping garage floors had quietly cracked a problem the military brass didn't even realize could be solved. The weapon that would ultimately save more American lives than any battlefield strategy wasn't born in any government laboratory. It began as a solution for spoiling chickens on a truck route running between South St. Paul and Chicago. Back in 1938, that Minnesota afternoon at Meadowbrook Country Club brought suffocating humidity, the kind of oppressive heat that had men tugging at their ties and dreaming of autumn relief. Harry Werner was 3 holes into his round when the clubhouse attendant came running across the pristine fairway with urgent news. His truck had broken down somewhere along the route between South St. Paul and Chicago. The refrigeration system, ice and salt packed around wooden crates using the same technique Civil War soldiers had relied on, had completely failed. 2,000 pounds of fresh chicken lay rotting, a complete financial disaster. Werner stood holding his 7-iron, mentally calculating the staggering loss. This wasn't his first catastrophe. It wouldn't be his last. The entire business of moving perishable goods across America operated on century-old principles. Ice got packed around cargo, drivers pushed hard to reach their destinations quickly, and everyone prayed the weather stayed cool. Temperature fluctuations destroyed everything. Ice melted unevenly. Salt corroded truck beds. Manual labor at every stop meant constantly repacking, replacing ice, monitoring conditions. Even under ideal circumstances, spoilage ate up 20 to 30% of shipments. During scorching days like this one, entire loads became expensive waste. Joe Numero was Werner's golf partner that afternoon, a man who'd built considerable wealth manufacturing sound equipment for movie theaters through his company, Cinema Supplies. Numero possessed that restless entrepreneurial temperament that viewed problems as fascinating puzzles rather than frustrating barriers. "You know what you actually need, Harry," Numero said, lining up his putt. "Put a refrigerator in your truck." It was meant as a throwaway joke, the kind of casual comment golf partners exchange when discussing someone's business troubles. Werner's expression suggested something different. This wasn't a punchline, but a genuinely intriguing possibility. "Could you really do that?" Numero straightened from his putting stance. "We can build a unit for you in 30 days. The obstacle was obvious. Joe Numero had absolutely no experience with refrigeration technology. Cinema Supplies built optical sound equipment for theaters, amplifiers, speakers, projection systems. But Numero possessed something more valuable than expertise. He had Frederick McKinley Jones. Jones had been born in Cincinnati in 1893 to an interracial couple in a city and time that showed no tolerance for such relationships. His mother passed when he was only 9. His father, unable to manage alone, sent the boy to live with a Catholic priest in Kentucky. After 2 years, young Frederick made his choice. Poverty and freedom seemed better than comfortable constraint. At age 11, he ran away. He found work in an automobile garage, sleeping in the back room, learning by watching experienced mechanics during daylight hours and studying technical manuals by lamplight at night. By 14, he worked full-time as a mechanic. By 15, he became foreman, directing grown men in an industry barely a decade old. The First World War interrupted his rise. Jones enlisted and shipped to France, where his mechanical talent proved far more valuable than rifle skills. He maintained communication systems, repaired vehicles that broke down far from supply sources, fixed X-ray machines that field hospitals depended upon. He taught electrical circuitry to fellow soldiers, breaking complex systems into manageable pieces. The army promoted him to sergeant, a real rank earned through genuine competence rather than connections, particularly meaningful for a black man in 1918. After returning home to Minnesota, Jones took a projectionist position in Hallock, a small farming town near the Canadian border. The routine work felt stifling. Within months, he'd constructed a radio transmitter for the entire town, using salvaged parts and technical drawings he created himself. The local newspaper covered his accomplishment. Numero, constantly hunting for talented people, read the story and drove north to meet this self-taught engineer who seemed capable of building anything. He hired Jones immediately to upgrade Cinema Supply's sound equipment. Jones didn't just improve it, he transformed it entirely. He engineered systems that eliminated feedback and sharpened audio clarity while simplifying installation procedures. His breakthroughs made Numero's company one of the region's most successful operations. So when Werner asked if refrigerating a truck was possible, Numero's confidence stemmed from 6 years observing Jones solve problems that formerly trained engineers said were impossible. Jones received the challenge with the composed demeanor of someone accustomed to being underestimated. Numero anticipated skepticism or requests for research time. Instead, Jones simply responded, "I guess I could fix up something." The actual challenge proved more intricate than it initially appeared. Refrigeration technology existed already. Iceboxes, cold storage facilities, even experimental refrigerated railroad cars. But installing a functional refrigeration system on a truck bouncing over unpaved roads through extreme temperature swings, operating dependably without constant attention, while consuming minimal fuel presented engineering obstacles nobody had cracked successfully. Compressors were too heavy. Refrigerant tubes fractured under relentless vibration. Power systems depleted batteries or demanded separate engines that added unwanted weight and complications. Jones attacked it characteristically, disregarding what people claimed couldn't be done and concentrating on what absolutely needed to work. He scavenged junkyards, salvaging components from discarded equipment, testing various arrangements in the Cinema Supply's workshop. He worked through load calculations, stress analysis, vibration frequencies. The refrigerant tubing required flexibility to absorb shock while maintaining pressure rigidity. The compressor needed positioning where it wouldn't consume cargo space yet, could still draw power effectively. After extensive testing, he developed a compact system with the compressor mounted underneath the trailer, powered by a 4-cylinder gasoline engine, circulating refrigerant through shock-resistant tubing to cooling coils throughout the cargo compartment. Werner purchased an aluminum truck and allowed Jones to install the working prototype. It functioned, not flawlessly. Early versions struggled with fuel consumption and temperature regulation, but it functioned. Fresh chickens arrived in Chicago still fresh. Numero filed the patent application on November 16, 1939. The United States Patent Office issued patent number 2300-3057 on July 12, 1940, for a practical mechanical refrigeration system for long-haul transportation. For 18 months, it remained a commercial advancement, solving spoilage problems for trucking companies hemorrhaging money to product loss. Then December 7, 1941, changed everything. Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor. The American military, which had spent 2 decades preparing to repeat previous wars, suddenly faced something entirely new. Wars spanning oceans and tropical jungles demanded logistical solutions no doctrine had foreseen. Hundreds of thousands of American troops would deploy to islands where intense heat rendered food dangerous within hours, and medicines deteriorated before reaching forward positions. The Pentagon focused on amphibious assault tactics and air superiority strategy. What it lacked was any method for maintaining soldier nutrition and health in the planet's deadliest climate. Frederick McKinley Jones had already invented exactly what was needed 2 years earlier while trying to prevent chickens from spoiling during transport. Now his invention would preserve lives. The Defense Department designated Jones's portable refrigeration unit as standard military equipment in 1941. But military enthusiasm collided immediately with battlefield reality. The original model, with its undercarriage-mounted compressor, proved too cumbersome for combat deployment. Trucks navigating destroyed roadways and improvised jungle paths couldn't accommodate the additional weight without sacrificing cargo space or fuel range. The redesigned model addressed weight concerns but created fresh problems. Components performing perfectly on American highways failed catastrophically under the punishment of off-road military operations. Jones returned to his workshop armed with field test feedback and began reconstructing from fundamental principles. The solution emerged in late 1941. Mount the entire refrigeration assembly on the vehicle's front exterior rather than underneath or within. This model positioned the compressor, engine, and refrigerant system in a streamlined housing attached to the trailer nose, distributing weight more efficiently while protecting internal components from road damage and enabling straightforward maintenance access. The design possessed elegant simplicity. Everything a mechanic required sat visible and accessible. No crawling beneath vehicles through mud or darkness. The unit endured punishment that decimated conventional equipment. Trucks traversed volcanic rock roads across the Pacific. Convoys climbed mountain passes through North Africa. Emergency evacuations rumbled over tracks barely wider than the vehicles themselves. The model kept operating. Manufacturing expanded throughout the early 1940s as Joe Numero made a choice demonstrating his faith in the technology's significance. He sold Cinema Supplies, the thriving business he'd spent years establishing, to RCA. Using those proceeds, he established a company focused exclusively on refrigeration, United States Thermo Control, which eventually became Thermo King. The military's gatekeepers weren't rejecting the technology because it didn't work. Their resistance came from something far more stubborn: institutional thinking about how armies had always done things. Procurement officials examined the specs and wondered aloud why soldiers needed fresh food when American forces had been defeating enemies for generations on hardtack and salt pork. Logistics commanders ran the numbers on fuel consumption, maintenance demands, and the overwhelming complexity of deploying thousands of refrigeration units across multiple war theaters. Operational planners looked at the weight and space these units demanded and pushed back hard. Ammunition, weapons, those deserved cargo priority, they argued, not what they called luxury equipment. The reasoning sounded perfectly sound in Washington conference rooms, echoing through marble hallways and oak-paneled offices. But that confidence collapsed the moment casualty reports started streaming in from the Pacific. Staggered across every theater, food poisoning outbreaks struck American forces with devastating effect. 76 separate incidents, 14,214 cases. Each outbreak pulled combat-ready soldiers from the line just as effectively as enemy bullets. The 374th Troop Carrier Group received canned turkey for Thanksgiving dinner, a meal calculated to lift the spirits of men thousands of miles from home. The entire unit contracted food poisoning and dysentery within hours. Hundreds of soldiers incapacitated, not by Japanese fire, but by their own rations. Every spoiled meal represented one fewer soldier available for duty. Every bout of intestinal illness meant days or weeks lost to recovery. The math became impossible to ignore. A division at full strength could execute its mission. A division with 20% of its personnel sidelined by contaminated food could not. Pentagon planners had obsessed over tonnage calculations for ammunition and replacement parts while failing to account for something equally significant: the tonnage of spoiled food being dumped in Pacific jungles because it arrived already rotten. Then came the blood plasma crisis, which transformed refrigeration from a food issue into a matter of literal life and death. Whole blood, the gold standard for treating traumatic injuries and shock, was desperately perishable. Without refrigeration, it deteriorated within hours. Dr. Charles Drew had revolutionized battlefield medicine by developing dried plasma that could be reconstituted in just 3 minutes and remained stable for extended periods. Medics could carry packets into combat, mix them with sterile water, and transfuse wounded soldiers lying in foxholes. Dried plasma rescued thousands of lives, but it had real limitations. For severe trauma, massive hemorrhage, and surgical procedures, whole blood performed better. The challenge was getting whole blood to field hospitals and keeping it viable during transport. Most evacuation hospitals, scattered across the Pacific, lacked adequate refrigeration. The equipment they possessed was engineered for stationary facilities with dependable power sources, not for field conditions where generators failed and supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean. Doctors watched whole blood arrive and spoil before they could use it. Soldiers who might have survived with proper transfusions died instead. The academic debate about whether troops needed fresh food transformed into an urgent operational question about whether the military could actually deliver blood transfusions that determined survival. Jones's portable units answered that problem. They were compact enough to parachute into forward combat areas. They operated independently of local power grids. They maintained consistent temperatures regardless of what conditions raged outside. Suddenly, field hospitals could store whole blood. Mobile surgical units could carry refrigerated supplies directly to frontline aid stations. The units originally designed to keep chickens fresh on Minnesota highways were now keeping soldiers alive in New Guinea jungles. Applications expanded rapidly once commanders grasped what the technology made possible. Refrigerated units cooled the cockpits of B-29 bombers, flying high-altitude missions where crews faced temperatures plummeting to 40 below zero at altitude and sweltering tropical heat on runways. They air-conditioned ambulance planes evacuating wounded soldiers on flights lasting hours, preventing shock and infection. They cooled field hospitals where heat and humidity transformed surgical wards into incubators for bacteria. Every application returned to the same fundamental truth. Keeping things cold in hot places kept soldiers alive. The resistance from procurement and logistics crumbled when confronted with operational reality. Fresh food reached front lines for the first time in military history, and disease rates that had ravaged early deployments began dropping dramatically. In the Mediterranean theater, 70% of field hospital casualties required blood transfusions, each receiving an average of 3 pints. Field hospitals received all the blood they requested. Headquarters never expected them to provide their own because the cold chain now functioned. The invisible infrastructure of refrigerated transport meant a soldier wounded in Italy received the same quality of care as one wounded in Texas. By 1944, the technology military leadership had initially dismissed as unnecessary luxury had become so essential that commanders demanded more units than manufacturers could produce. The golf course joke had become the backbone of military medicine. Frederick McKinley Jones, who learned engineering by reading books after sweeping garage floors, had built the system enabling modern battlefield trauma care. Deployment began in earnest in 1942 when refrigeration units started appearing in combat zones across the Pacific, North Africa, and eventually Europe. The units parachuted into forward areas where roads didn't exist, dropping alongside ammunition and medical supplies. What landed in those supply drops was more than just equipment. It was the infrastructure for keeping soldiers combat-ready in environments that had previously guaranteed their deterioration. For the first time in military history, fresh food reached soldiers in foxholes and forward bases. Meat arrived still frozen, vegetables stayed crisp, dairy products didn't curdle in tropical heat. The psychological impact matched the nutritional benefits. Soldiers subsisting on canned rations and hardtack suddenly received meals reminding them they remained connected to civilization thousands of miles away. Morale improvements showed up in after-action reports alongside casualty figures. The real revolution was medical. Refrigerated trucks became mobile blood banks, transporting whole blood from collection points to field hospitals with the same reliability ammunition trains moved shells. Drugs that degraded in heat, anti-malarials, antibiotics, anesthetics, now reached frontline medical stations still potent. Field hospitals stored plasma, whole blood, and temperature-sensitive medications without depending on unreliable local power or ice deliveries. In the Mediterranean, where 70% of casualties required transfusions averaging 3 pints each, supply never ran short. Headquarters provided all requested blood because the cold chain made it logistically feasible. Surgeons operating within artillery range had the same access to fresh whole blood as doctors far behind the lines. The scale expanded beyond anything the Red Cross attempted before the war. Across the United States, collection centers gathered blood from civilian donors in the largest coordinated medical mobilization in human history. By war's end, the Red Cross would collect 13 million pints for military use, an average of more than 9,000 pints daily for 4 years. Every pint required refrigeration from collection to transfusion. Without Jones's portable units, most would have spoiled in transit or storage. The logistics became most visible during Operation Overlord. On the eve of D-Day in May 1944, the Theatre Blood Bank delivered over 1,100 pints to landing ships and British hospital carriers preparing for the Normandy invasion. That blood, packed in ice and insulated containers, crossed the English Channel in the first assault waves. Medics treated wounded soldiers on the beaches with fresh whole blood refrigerated continuously from collection in England through Channel transport to transfusion in Normandy. Truck-mounted refrigerators distributed blood inland to field hospital platoons at division clearing stations, maintaining the cold chain as supply lines stretched deeper into France. The system worked because Jones designed equipment field mechanics could repair with salvaged parts and basic tools. His junkyard engineering background, that instinct to build things that could be fixed rather than replaced, became the template for field maintenance across all theaters. When units broke down under combat conditions, mechanics improvised repairs using parts cannibalized from damaged vehicles or fabricated from available materials. The equipment could be maintained by men who'd never seen refrigeration systems before the war, but understood engines, compressors, and mechanical principles. Technology spread beyond ground transport. Refrigerated units cooled B-29 bomber cockpits, solving a problem plaguing high-altitude missions since strategic bombing began. Crews flying at altitudes where outside temperatures dropped to 40 below zero faced frostbite and hypothermia while their aircraft baked in 100-degree tropical heat. Jones's units air-conditioned the cockpits, keeping crews functional during long-range missions over Japan. Ambulance planes received the same technology, transforming aerial evacuation from desperate last resort into viable medical procedure. Wounded soldiers evacuated from jungle clearing stations to rear hospitals endured flights lasting hours. Without climate control, tropical heat, cabin pressure changes, and physical trauma created conditions where shock and infection killed soldiers who'd survived their initial injuries. Refrigerated air conditioning stabilized temperatures, reduced shock, and gave wounded men a fighting chance to reach surgical care alive. Field hospitals in the Pacific deployed refrigeration against an enemy more relentless than Japanese infantry: tropical disease. Heat and humidity turned surgical wards into bacterial breeding grounds. Post-operative infections killed soldiers surviving battlefield trauma. Air-conditioned hospital tents reduced infection rates and allowed surgeons to operate in conditions that didn't compromise sterile procedures. Commanders initially resisting refrigeration as unnecessary luxury now submitted requisitions demanding priority delivery of additional units. Fresh food forward evolved from experimental doctrine into operational standard. Medical officers documented dramatic improvements in soldier health and combat effectiveness. The abstract debates about tonnage and fuel consumption became irrelevant when confronted with units maintaining higher operational readiness because disease rates dropped and morale improved. The cultural shift within the military was complete. Refrigeration was no longer viewed as comfort equipment, but as a combat multiplier. A well-fed, healthy soldier with proper medical care fought more effectively than a malnourished, disease-ridden soldier, regardless of weapons or training. The innovation beginning with spoiled chickens on a Minnesota golf course had become foundational infrastructure for modern warfare. Generals planned operations around the assumption that fresh food and viable medicine would reach their troops. That assumption depended entirely on thousands of portable refrigeration units designed by a self-taught mechanic who learned his trade reading technical manuals in the back of an auto garage in Cincinnati. Frederick McKinley Jones had not just invented better refrigeration, he had redefined what armies needed to win wars. The war itself was validating every prediction he'd made. Soldiers across the theaters were eating fresh food, receiving medicine that actually worked, surviving what should have been fatal injuries because whole blood arrived preserved and ready to transfuse. The network that seemed untouchable in 1943 began developing serious problems by the middle of 1944. The appetite for refrigeration units far exceeded what factories could manufacture, gaps that no amount of industrial effort could possibly bridge. Thermocane would reach $3 million in value by 1949. Yet during those war years, the company faced material restrictions that capped production, no matter how urgent the military need became. Each refrigeration unit demanded steel for the frame, copper for the piping, aluminum for the cooling components, and fuel engines for the compressing machinery. Those same materials were desperately needed for tanks rolling across continents, bombers filling the skies, warships patrolling oceans, and weapon systems consuming the finite supply of industrial output. The War Production Board distributed materials according to strategic priorities that shifted constantly with battlefield needs. Refrigeration ranked as crucial but not fundamental in the mathematics of total warfare. When steel ran short, tanks got the shipments first. When copper became scarce, electrical systems keeping bombers aloft took precedence. Thermocane secured sufficient materials to keep producing, but never quite enough to satisfy the field commanders who discovered what the technology delivered and demanded it immediately. The shortages rippled backward through the entire supply network. Units already positioned in combat areas started malfunctioning at rates that field technicians couldn't handle. The wet heat of tropical regions corroded the electrical connections, constant jolting from rough terrain fractured the refrigerant piping. Engines built for smooth American roads couldn't cope with the poor quality fuel available at forward positions. Sand and dust got into supposedly protected components and seized the compressors solid. The very conditions making refrigeration absolutely necessary also degraded the machinery faster than anyone had calculated. When refrigeration units quit working, all the old problems came rushing right back. Foodstuffs decayed in the oppressive warmth, pharmaceuticals broke down, blood plasma turned unusable, soldiers returned to eating canned rations and hardtack, while perfectly good produce rotted in silent refrigerated trucks. Field medical facilities that had been conducting sophisticated operations with dependable supplies of whole blood abruptly faced shortages, forcing impossible choices about which wounded men would get blood and which wouldn't. The morale boost that fresh provisions had brought disappeared once personnel realized the supply couldn't be trusted. Outbreaks of food poisoning multiplied whenever the refrigeration system failed. The figures painted a grim picture. Troops sickened by spoiled provisions in sufficient numbers to damage their fighting capability. Medical personnel wrote detailed reports linking refrigeration breakdowns directly to infection rates, documenting what had been obvious since combat commenced in the Pacific, maintaining the cold-preserved well-being and breaking the chain-produced sickness. The human price showed up in casualty lists that never separated deaths from gunfire from deaths caused by supply failures. A soldier perishing from contaminated food because his unit's refrigeration truck malfunctioned was deceased just as completely as one struck down by a sharpshooter. A wounded man who succumbed to bleeding because viable blood plasma wasn't obtainable in time left an identical void in the platoon structure. The organizational skepticism about refrigeration that prevailed in early 1942 appeared appallingly careless when observed through the perspective of 1944's supply crises. Field repair specialists became the unsung heroes through creative solutions that Frederick Jones himself would have admired. The salvage engineering methods that Jones had pioneered, manufacturing his initial prototype, became standard practice for maintaining machinery in active battle. Technicians stripped broken vehicles for usable parts, welded replacement pieces from scrap materials, and performed unconventional fixes that breached every regulation but preserved the refrigeration equipment. They circulated knowledge among themselves, teaching which civilian auto components could work with military specifications and which field modifications actually enhanced function under difficult circumstances. The military created specialized maintenance facilities at major logistical centers, equipping them with specialists trained exclusively on refrigeration machinery. These locations accumulated replacement parts, restored damaged units, and offered guidance to field technicians calling in with questions. Though less efficient than delivering fresh factory units, it kept enough equipment operational to sustain the cold chain when newly manufactured equipment couldn't arrive rapidly enough. International collaboration helped address some gaps American manufacturing couldn't fill. The British military had developed their own refrigeration technology for campaigns across North Africa and Asia. American and British logistical personnel worked jointly, coordinating the exchange of machinery, spare parts, and technical knowledge. When American forces experienced shortages, British refrigerated transport supplemented the pipelines. When British personnel needed particular parts, American supply stations delivered them. The arrangement was founded on practical necessity rather than altruism. Both powers recognized that maintaining soldier wellness served mutual interests. As 1944 progressed into late fall, manufacturing priorities underwent fundamental transformation, recognizing refrigeration's demonstrated importance. The War Production Board expanded resource assignments to Thermo King and approved new manufacturing facilities. Military contracting departments, once questioning whether personnel needed unpreserved meals, now positioned refrigeration as core logistics infrastructure matching ammunition and petroleum. Hardware that remained experimental in 1942 had become universal by victory. The innovation spread into destroyers and cargo planes, into applications Jones had never originally imagined. Vessels carrying temperature-controlled pharmaceuticals and blood products crossing Pacific waters equipped refrigeration, maintaining the chain cold, beginning at American docks, terminating at forward island installations. Cargo transports carried refrigerated compartments, preserving pharmaceuticals during multi-day voyages above oceanic expanses. The underlying concept stayed consistent. Preserving temperature saved soldier lives regardless whether mounted on vehicles, seacraft, or aircraft. The ultimate phase moving toward peace witnessed portable refrigeration deployed throughout every region, becoming embedded within operational strategy at the uppermost command levels. Generals arranging invasions incorporated refrigeration availability into their computations alongside ammunition requirements and personnel numbers. Medical commanders positioned field hospitals considering refrigeration access rather than merely proximity to fighting. Logistics coordinators supervised temperature maintenance with identical rigor previously applied to fuel and replacement equipment. The organization that nearly fractured in 1944 strengthened through flexibility, accommodating constraints instead of postponing until perfection appeared. Field repair specialists demonstrated that Jones's engineering proved resilient enough for reconstruction using simple equipment and mechanical skill. The organizational opposition that had obstructed adoption evaporated, confronted with documentation proving refrigeration sustained existence and improved military performance. When Japan capitulated in August 1945, portable refrigeration had penetrated military procedures so comprehensively that imagining operations without it became impossible. The innovation endured its pressure point, confirming that the cold chain ranked equally with supply networks distributing bullets and explosives to warfare's essence. The reckoning arrived in 1945 when the military began tabulating information requiring decades for thorough review. Nearly 1 million instances of jungle diseases infected American servicemen solely throughout the Pacific Zone. Fever brought by mosquitoes, dengue, intestinal sickness, and conditions most hadn't heard preceding deployment. The documentation revealed warfare extending across dual battlegrounds against adversary troops and microscopic organisms indifferent to nationality, rank, or character. Contagion casualties throughout initial Pacific operations exceeded battlefield deaths multiplied 7 times, occasionally tenfold. By conflict's terminus, those proportions transformed completely. Complete statistics eluded documentation amid worldwide chaos and interwoven medical initiatives preventing precise accounting. Yet observable enhancements appeared across all locations. Personnel consumed fresh provisions extending from northern Pacific regions through southern territories to Mediterranean coastlines. Transfusions resurrected thousands facing demise from trauma and blood reduction in previous conflicts. Therapeutics traversed battle lines, remaining sufficiently powerful, countering bacterial threats, representing prior fatalities without cold conservation. Frederick McKinley Jones obtained acknowledgement, arriving tardily and cautiously, delivered filtering through the discriminatory framework pervading 1940s American culture. During 1944, he achieved first African-American membership within the American Society of Refrigeration Engineers, recognition honoring technical contributions while deliberately sidestepping acknowledging a self-educated mechanic representing exceptional capability. The professional fraternity admitted him to their association nearly half a century, succeeding his independent education, pursuing technical literature during evening hours succeeding floor cleaning responsibilities. The National Medal of Technology appeared substantially afterward, conveyed posthumously in 1991 via President George Bush, honoring Joseph Numero and Frederick McKinley Jones. Jones became the foremost African-American recipient, honored for breakthroughs eventually reshaping planetary commerce and preserving innumerable existences. Yet the honor reached 29 years subsequent Jones's passing, distant beyond when recognition could have indicated importance to the designer deserving it. The postponement remained deliberate dismissal. It manifested institutional erasure. The organizational myopia characterizing American treatment regarding African-American accomplishment throughout the century. Throughout hostilities, Jones remained comparatively unrecognized. Journalism regarding military advancement innovations seldom referenced his contribution. Patriotic marketing, emphasizing production strength, withheld crediting specific technicians enabling capacity. Media presentations displaying refrigerated transportation equipment emerged repeatedly. Yet the engineer creating the refrigerating apparatus maintained obscurity. The apparatus received celebration, whereas its creator disappeared. A circumstance recognizable throughout Jim Crow-era credential allocation. Joseph Numero championed Jones persistently both during and afterward, insisting documentation and specialized literature properly acknowledged Jones's contributions. Numero comprehended his contribution encompassed recognizing extraordinary talent and supplying financial backing, not inventiveness itself. Yet Numero's efforts couldn't dismantle structural obstacles, rendering African-American engineering contributions invisible throughout white establishments. Jones persisted working, acquiring beyond 60 patents accumulated through professional life, 40 concentrated upon refrigeration machinery. He tackled challenges because addressing problems constituted his function, independent regarding anticipated recognition. The business expansion his innovation catalyzed manifested noticeably following hostilities' closure. Manufacturing transitioned smoothly, military configurations transferring toward business manufacture, swiftly disrupting harvest sectors. Temporary cultivars restricted to nearby commerce could ship spanning continents. Oranges cultivated throughout California reached distribution centers in Boston while remaining chilled. Cheese produced across Midwest territories shipped toward Gulf locations, maintaining temperature. Commerce incorporated perishable merchandise crossing seas, fostering commercial association anchored upon Jones's innovation. The breakthrough provided foundation, establishing contemporary retail purchasing, permitting buyers obtaining seasonally unavailable locally merchandise available elsewhere worldwide. By 2015, greater than 70% material transportation domestically incorporated refrigeration equipment, demonstrating how comprehensively Jones's innovation had transformed into invisible utility. Nobody contemplated refrigeration resembling 1800s inhabitants, considering ice harvesting and temperature reduction. It merely persisted, trustworthy and widespread, facilitating nourishment organization seeming inconceivable throughout 1938 whenever Jones mounted machinery onto Harry Warner's metallic transport. Jones expired on February 21, 1961, aged 67, succumbing to respiratory malignancy throughout Minneapolis. He departed from the equivalent municipality where he'd assembled the preliminary refrigeration equipment 23 years preceding, where he'd remedied the difficulty regarding putrefying chickens that transformed into salvation for expiring servicemen. The newspaper summary acknowledged his technical contributions, though inadequately represented accomplishment totality, partially reflecting journalism's insufficiency addressing breakthrough achievement, partially because existence he'd created rendered his innovation appear foreordained retrospectively. Disclosure manifested when historians inspected planetary hostility logistics possessing temporal distance. The deadliest apparatus deployed throughout that struggle existed not within nuclear weapons, nor ocean-going combat vessels, nor armored vehicles. It encompassed refrigeration apparatus mounted beneath trucks, constructed by an individual acquiring engineering comprehension, absorbing resources during night hours, succeeding employment, sweeping auto repair workshop floor throughout Ohio. Frederick McKinley Jones fractured through applying portable refrigeration, addressing difficulty preventing mortality beyond any adversary formation. He rescued greater quantity of American personnel compared to military commanders, achieving textbook prominence and monument dedication. He modified military methodology, residential eating habits, pharmacological availability toward distant inhabitants. The temperature preservation infrastructure he generated penetrated contemporary civilization so profoundly, non-existence represented inconceivability, advancement transforming into invisible framework, because accomplishment functioned flawlessly that necessity disappeared from consciousness. Jones accomplished this by addressing spoiled poultry trouble occurring throughout Minnesota recreational facility, displaying genius transcending institutional environment, societal parentage, ethnicity, encompassing difficulty recognition and perseverance, executing remedy. Warfare occurring within contemporary period succeeds not from combat intensity, rather from nutritional excellence, wellness conditions, sustained effectiveness maintained via logistical mechanisms, providing personnel nourishment alongside pharmaceutical viability and accessible restorative substances. Frederick McKinley Jones grasped this truth preceding establishment recognition, preceding military legislation, preceding resistance yielded evidentially. He originated equipment, establishing that provisioning personnel represented warfare's supreme apparatus, accomplishing implementation, mirroring resourceful ingenuity, permeating development, pragmatic, dependable, and unremarkable through exceptional execution.